Grace is an understudied phenomenon by psychologists of religion. In one sense, this is not surprising, given, of course, that we cannot empirically study grace, especially divine grace, directly. Rather, as psychologists, we investigate the perceptions of grace and how those perceptions function in daily living. Now, you'd expect, at least I expected, that, boy, this would be a hot topic, one that's been around for quite a while in the psychology of religion. First of all, grace is a very central concept, certainly in Christianity and in Christian theology. Since most of the psychology of religion has focused primarily on Christianity here, at least in North America, which is where most of the research has been done, you would have thought that somebody would have thought of the topic of grace, but it's largely been disregarded by psychologists of religion. And yet I think it is a fertile ground for research in the psychology of religion. And in line with some of the things I said yesterday, we ought to have some inside information, an inside track, if you will, on this particular topic as integrationists. Now, I attribute much of this disregard to the fact that even perceptions of divine grace, or for that matter, human grace to each other, have not neatly fit within existing theoretical frameworks in the psychology of religion. You can't, if it doesn't fit into a framework, then usually psychologists have trouble studying it and even comprehending it. So, as with yesterday, there we go. I do want to acknowledge the work of the John Templeton Foundation. I appreciate so much their support of my work. So yesterday, if you recall, I asked us to expand our vision of integration to include not only integration as it has been traditionally viewed in terms of high-level theology and psychology, that's what yesterday I called propositional integration, but also in terms of how integrative lives are actually lived, what I called experiential integration. And in so doing, I suggested that we must understand the cultural context of the religious experience so that we can better comprehend how religiously committed people uniquely make sense of their lives and how they make meaning even of the ordinary. And this will require, and I just lightly touched on the notion of proximal measures of religious experience, including religious inflections of the world, even of the ordinary world. I also recommended that psychologists of religion be more open to an emic approach to their study, and that this will involve taking today what I'm going to call a first-person perspective. And I want to elaborate on that point just a bit further. But before I do, I often have the experience whenever I give a plenary talk, or for that matter, even a breakout session, that I go away, and I don't know, boy, I'm talking to a lot of clinical psychologists. I have to be careful here. But I often go away sort of beating up myself a little bit and saying, oh, you sure messed that point up, or you forgot to mention this. And so last night I went through some of that exercise. And then it dawned on me, wait a minute, I've got today to make amends. And the one thing that hit me was that I don't think I was clear, and as a matter of fact, I know I wasn't clear because I didn't even mention it, but sometimes that's my clearest statement is the ones that I don't mention. But anyway, that what really is my motivation behind a lot of this? And so back in 1999, I wrote a paper. It was published in the International Journal for the Psychology of Religion. And I told, the audience then was psychologists of religion. And I was saying, I think religion and the study of religious experience, because it is so central to so many people, has a lot to offer the field of psychology. And I went into some various avenues that I thought where we really have something to offer the field as a whole. And that theme has kind of stayed with me, except that I've also begun to translate it to integration work as well. That I think integration has something to offer the psychology of religion. That's my point in some ways yesterday. And I think the psychology of religion as well as integration together has something to offer the field as a whole. Now, and I want us to do that, basically, is what I was really wanting to say, and what motivates me a lot in my own thinking. And to illustrate this, or to try to provide an image that might help, I used to teach at a school in upstate New York, or just north of New York City, not far up. Everything north of New York City is just called upstate, you know. And so I was only about 20 to 30 miles north of New York City. And it was a very nice campus, beautiful campus. But it was not the traditional campus where you had a quad in the middle and buildings all strategically placed around the quad. Instead, it was kind of a hodgepodge of buildings. And what was unique about the architectural structure of that campus was that right in the center of the campus, what you would think of as kind of an area for the quad, that was the soccer field. And in some ways, that was neat because when there were soccer games, that became sort of the convening point for the community. And my guess is that the soccer coach and the team probably appreciated that, because if they were off into the side of the campus somewhere, which is typically what happens with many athletic facilities, people won't get over to the game as much. But here it was right in the center of the campus. And so I would attend the games. I probably would have attended them anyway because I like soccer, but one of the things that I noticed was that there was a grassy area kind of off on the side. And so often families would come and to these games, even people in the community. And over on that side in that grassy area, invariably, there was another game going on of about 8 to 10-year-olds, okay? And they were playing soccer too. And I noticed that, and I use that as kind of an analogy to say, well, in some ways, the mainstream of psychology is that big soccer game that everybody else came to see, and us integrationists are over there on the side doing our own little game. And I don't mean to say that in any condescending sort of way, to suggest that our game is any less important. As a matter of fact, in some ways, you could argue, again, using the analogy of the soccer field, that the skill development and so forth was absolutely necessary for those kids to be over there playing, in hopes that someday some of them might actually be on the big field. Okay, and so I'm using that as sort of a challenge, I guess, for us to be thinking about integration and how we can infiltrate the field better than what we've done. And in all honesty, and I'm not just saying this because I'm at Fuller, I think you guys are doing a better job of it than most institutions. So I just wanted to recognize that. But now back to the need for a first-person perspective. So last year I had the opportunity to present the following question in a plenary address to a group of psychologists of religion. And you have to understand, that was the population, quite a different population than here. There would be some people, and in fact, there were a few of you who are here today that were at that address. But when you're talking to a group of psychologists of religion, it's a very varied group. You've got folks who are committed to a religious faith tradition, Christianity, as well as other traditions. And you've got people who are highly skeptical, who think they can explain religion away. And you are trying to address a group that's so varied on some of these issues. So it was in that context that I asked this question: have we, as psychologists of religion, at least implicitly adopted a position that usurps the authority of religion as it is experienced in psychological life? That is, do we, as psychologists of religion, in our attempt to explain and predict, tend to define our objects of study only on our own terms and not the terms of the people we study. So to illustrate, I'm going to consider this question, just as I did last year, today, in terms of what many of us might consider an extreme example: serpent handling. Back in 2005, Ralph Hood, who was also the co-editor with me of that volume that Brad Strawn mentioned earlier, Ralph Hood, Paul Williamson, and myself wrote a book on the psychology of religious fundamentalism. And we intentionally, this was 2005, we intentionally challenged much of the psychological work at that time studying fundamentalists. Our argument was the fundamentalists are being studied not in terms of what they believe, but in terms of what we as psychologists believe about them. So we developed a model of how we thought psychologists should be, not how psychologists should be studied, how fundamentalists should be studied. Boy, it'd be a different model if it was psychologists, believe me. But how we thought fundamentalists should be studied. And we called that the intratextual approach. You know, I sort of joke about that. It would be different, but no, I think a lot of this, and Randy Sorensen actually touched on this in his book, Minding Spirituality, when he said that he didn't use the word intratextuality, but he was arguing that we stay pretty close to our own little cultural texts as well in our field. At any rate, we argued that to explain how the fundamentalist thinks and feels, you have to first understand their worldview, or what we called their text, be it written or oral, formal or informal. And each of my co-authors of that book has spent a good part of their career studying serpent handlers. And in fact, one of the chapters in the book was the application of this intratextual model to serpent handling. Serpent handlers have specific scriptural passages, and in particular, one in the Gospel of Mark, from which they have built a theology of serpent handling. A theology of serpent handling, mind you. So in an interview published in the spring 2018 issue of Eye on Psychi, this is a publication of the National Honorary in Psychology that's produced by undergraduates, one of the co-authors, Ralph Hood, argues that psychologists have too often taken on the authority role regarding people's faith. That is, this is what he had to say, and as usual, Ralph says it better than I can. So I'm going to give you this quotation, and I'm going to read it. I know it's kind of long, and it might be a little difficult to read. But first, before you try to explain a person's belief, behaviors, or thoughts, you have to get to know them. And the person you are studying has to accept your description. For example, you might tell me serpent handlers are ignorant, but I know serpent handlers who are twice as bright as you are. And by the way, the context of this, the entire article was on serpent handling. So immediately he jumped right into this in this quotation. So the first thing you have to do is get rid of any stereotypes you might hold. You have to see the world the way they see it. That's the first task of a psychologist. Then second, if you think you've got an explanation, that's a separate task. Because for every person who thinks the religion is an illusion or an escape from something, somebody else believes deeply in the ontological reality. Psychologists should be humble in what they can do, and they should be sensitive to doing their homework, which is actually getting to know the people, their beliefs and their practices before they try to get intense psychological descriptions, always. In short, what I think Ralph is saying is that we need to do a better job of taking a first-person perspective. Instead, our tendency is to take a functional approach to our subject matter, whether religion or spirituality, whether it's perceived to be the cause, the consequence, the mediating, the moderating variable, to whatever is our reference point of study. And so I mentioned yesterday some of the research, just sort of in passing on spirituality and health. And often religion or spirituality is just sort of the add-on. You know, is that just one more thing that we could just look at the correlation and as if that's going to tell us very much? However, I asked this question, I asked it of the psychologists of religion last year. Would the psychology of religion and spirituality be better served if researchers devote more time to the substance of what people actually believe and practice in their religious and spiritual lives? Then perhaps we can understand why religion and spirituality functions as it does. So that's the context once again. And I know that's reiterating some of the points yesterday, but like I said, Ralph says it so well. I just love that little quotation, and I think it does a better job of communicating some of the things that I tried to say yesterday than actually what I said. So I was recently, now let's talk about conceptualizing grace here. I was recently privileged to work with three outstanding scholars, the personality psychologist Robert Emmons, Fuller's own Justin Barrett, who I think is here somewhere today. Oh, Justin. And the theologian Kelly Kapik on a conceptual paper of perceptions of divine grace. And doing our research for that conceptual paper, we discovered that grace is a concept in many religious and philosophical traditions, and we provide examples in that paper. Some might justifiably argue, I think it's justifiable, that it is more of a central feature in the Christian tradition than in the other traditions. But regardless of whether someone agrees with that or disagrees with that, I will be consistent with the perspective presented yesterday and take an emic approach where I focus intentionally on perceptions of grace within the context of only the Christian faith. So in that paper, we define grace as the gift of acceptance given unconditionally and voluntarily to an undeserving person by an unobligated giver. If a person deserves the gift of acceptance, then it's not grace, in that the agent would have an obligation. That is, you should rightly recognize those who deserve, based on their merit, some sort of recognition. So we go on to say, because we knew this might be one of the more difficult to understand and perhaps controversial aspects of our definition, that in this definition, obligation refers to social expectations concerning how the agent and the recipient should normally act due to differences in status, in role, or whether the recipient has wronged the agent. Indeed, actually, grace involves the agent being anti-obligated to act, not merely unobligated, in that it operates under conditions of complete discharge of social obligations. So based on this definition, we distinguish grace from related constructs in the paper. Some of them, altruism, love, each one of these we devoted at least a paragraph or two to what's the difference between grace and some of these. Altruism, love, compassion, mercy, forgiveness, justice, and gratitude, which is one that we'll be talking about more tomorrow, but I'm also going to allude to it some today. Grace is similar to many of these virtues, but it also has distinctive qualities that make it unique and different from each virtue. It is beyond our purposes here to elaborate those differences, but again, they are covered in that paper if you are at all interested. So I'd like for us to consider a biblical understanding of divine grace for just a moment. And yes, and another rather lengthy quotation. I apologize for that, but I think it hits the point so well. And this time it's from Mark McMinn, who in 2008 wrote a book that has been influential in my own thinking on sin and grace. He says, somewhere along the journey of being raised evangelical, and Dr. McMinn is a professor up at George Fox College, and then staying in the evangelical church as an adult, I picked up a view of sin and grace that was quite forensic in nature. That is, sin is a violation of God's moral will, and grace is God's decision to forgive our sins through the life and work of Jesus. I still hold to this view, but I'm gaining a new appreciation for the relational context of the Christian story. It is not that God comes up with arbitrary rules and then rewards or punishes us based on our compliance. Rather, God is relational, and created us to be relational. The power of God's love is the most remarkable part of the Christian narrative. So grace, according to McMinn, and I concur, is intended to build relationship. It is the experiential nature of that relationship that provides a much more thorough and rich pleasure in grasping what is good and what is beautiful about divine grace. It is the experiential nature of divine grace that helps us apprehend the depth of Philip Yancey's question in his highly influential book of about 2 decades ago, What is so amazing about grace? It is something that once we experience it more fully, we will, with clenched fists, want to hold on to it very tightly. And when we do hold on to grace, we make significant steps towards becoming the fully actualized person God intends us to be. Now, you might have noticed in our definition that we called grace a gift of acceptance. And grace is best thought of as a gift, according to the theologian John Barclay. He wrote what I understand is a very influential book on Paul in the gift, I think was the title, or at least the primary title. There is probably a subtitle associated with it, in 2015. And gifts at the time of Paul's writing in the New Testament, Barclay suggests, contain multifaceted meanings, and therefore gift giving, that is grace, often defies a neat, unified conceptualization. Barclay provides an anthropology and history of gifting based on Jewish construals of divine beneficence. This is the context under which Paul's theology of the Christ event as the ultimate divine gift is to be understood. Barclay identifies 6 different conceptual extensions of grace, and he uses the term perfection to illustrate a concept, the concept of grace here, in its most extreme form. So I had a little trouble kind of getting it at first, okay, this perfection. And then it became clear when in his description he said, just like we talk about the perfect storm, you know, we've had a few of those here recently. Or we talk about somebody being a perfect pain. that given those, you kind of get the sense of the notion of perfection. It's carrying it to its extreme form, okay, is what we're talking about here. And so he suggests that it is different perfections of grace that will help us understand and explain how Paul's notion of the ultimate gift of grace has been received in varied and sometimes contradictory ways. So with that in mind, there are some of these that are listed here. And the first one that's listed, singularity, is, he would argue, is kind of at odds with the notion of divine grace. So based on his study of the ancient literature, Barclay concluded that one perfecting grace is based on the characteristic of the giver rather than the gift itself. According to Barclay, this perfecting grace of singularity is understood in terms of benevolence or goodness as the giver's sole and exclusive mode of operation. And the reason why this is somewhat at odds is that this is an understanding that is totally devoid of justice and holiness, and thus, he argues, it is at odds with the Christian conception of divine grace, at least as Paul identified it in the New Testament, in those letters. But then there are some other perfections of grace that Barclay identifies. And these are, he would argue, compatible with Christian notions of divine grace. Again, these were notions of grace or of gifting, because grace equals gift. I think I mentioned that in the slide, yeah. And these notions of gifting were Jewish notions at the time of the Christ event. Barclay found that sometimes it's the lavishness of the gift that comprises a perfecting gift or a perfecting grace. A supreme deity has the ability to give very extremely extravagant gifts. Baylor refers to a gift of such extremity in Christianity found in the Christ event itself as the perfecting grace of superabundance. The timing of the gift, what Barclay refers to as priority, is yet another perfection of grace. It is the giver of grace who takes the initiative in the gifting process and is therefore under no obligation due to previous circumstances. The recipient is only the beneficiary and did nothing to influence the process. The effect of the gift on the recipient, thus highlighting that the gift achieves some sort of desired ends, is yet another way to think about grace. This perfecting grace of efficacy, when applied to divine agency, simply means that grace has led to, we're talking about divine grace now, to redemption and restoration of a desired relationship with humanity. So here are three that we would fall into the compatible category. And then there are two in particular that Barclay suggests Paul's notion really turns upside down the notion of grace as it was understood in the Jewish culture of that time. The grace perfection of non-circularity. And by this now, I'm talking about it from the perspective of Paul. So the Jewish perspective on this would have been one of circularity, okay? So the grace perfection of non-circularity stresses the uniqueness of divine grace from grace between humans. You see, gift giving can easily lead to a form of manipulation, such that the recipient feels obliged to return a favor. But it is only, according to Paul, a sovereign God who expects no such return because God needs nothing. Thus, beneficiaries are free from the need to return the favor. Now, each of these perfections, with the exception of singularity thus far, do not contradict. And as I mentioned, are compatible with the Pauline notion, although in the case of circularity, it is just the opposite, okay, of what the Jews of that time thought. However, Barclay maintains that none of these alone contain the central and distinctive feature of the apostles' conception. It is the last of the perfecting graces reviewed here that most fully sets apart Paul's understanding and thus a classical Christian conception of grace from the rest of the ancient world. And I would argue probably from the rest of the contemporary world as well. And that's this notion of incongruity. Gifting in the ancient world was in accordance with the goodness of the recipient. That is, the beneficiary must be worthy of the gift for the gift itself to be considered suitable and appropriate. In contrast, the Christian conception of divine grace, as promoted by Paul, was that the goodness of the recipient had nothing to do with God's grace. It is the perfecting grace of incongruity that is most highlighted by Paul as that which most distinguishes God's grace from all other perfecting graces. So what I'd like for us to do is to take these notions from Barclay and to think about how are they being construed today. And I don't have time to go into a lot of detail about each of these and how these perfections may contribute to a conceptual understanding of grace, but I do want to elaborate briefly upon some of them. And I should say that my comments here, and largely from this point on throughout pretty much the remaining part of today's talk, are somewhat speculative because there's not research. The research is virtually non-existent at this point on some of these issues. But there is some research, quite a bit of research that's done in the psychology of gratitude. And as I pointed out earlier, grace is not exactly the same as gratitude, even though the two are related. And I'm wondering, could we look at any of that research that might give us a few hints about how people might understand or think about grace. Now, there's another problem here, and the problem is that most of the research on gratitude is not about gratitude to God. In fact, there's very little research on gratitude to God. Psychologists of religion haven't thought much about that. Strangely enough, it just doesn't seem to connect. But there is a lot on human-to-human gratitude. And of course, then that leaves open the question, well, if we're talking about divine grace, is it even worth our time to talk about human-to-human gratitude? Because vertical gratitude and horizontal gratitude might be quite different things. So I think that's a legitimate question, but just bear with me and allow me to speculate, okay, based upon this literature. So let's think about the gift's superabundance. That's the gift's lavishness for just a moment. And in Jewish way of thinking, and it was, again, compatible with Paul's notion, that this could be an indication of the value of the gift. One will find from the gratitude research, again, human to human primarily is where this research has existed, that indeed people are more grateful for favors that are of higher value to them, especially if the cost to the benefactor is perceived to be greater. Now, I think that's kind of an interesting little qualifier right there, because I would say, and maybe the theologians can help me on this, but it seems like my understanding would be, well, there isn't such a thing as a cost to God, not when you have infinite resources available. But, that might be a question that we would want to address, but I would need some help on that. The gift's priority, let's think about that for a moment. With regard to the timing of the gift, that the gifter, I should say, makes the initial move in gifting. And this may be indirectly supported by gratitude research that suggests that gifts or favors are received with greater gratitude when they are unexpected. And there is, by the way, these points on gratitude is all supported by empirical research. There's a very well-known study done back in 1988. So it's a bit dated, but it still stands as a very seminal piece of research that shows that we're really thankful when we are caught by surprise by something. It is, however, the perfection of incongruity, once again, that Barclay maintains as the central feature of divine grace. That is, God's grace has nothing to do with the merit of the recipient. So I'm not, aware of any empirical evidence on precisely this point, nor am I really aware of much empirical evidence in the gratitude research area, even on person-to-person gratitude, that has implications for the perfection of incongruity. But it does stand to reason that people are going to be more grateful for gifts that they don't think they deserve, which then has those implications that are there. There is one study done back in 1990 that people feel more grateful to higher status benefactors. That might be, very speculative, whether or not that has some suggestions towards incongruity or not. But that's the only study I can think of that might give us a little bit of a sneak peek into how people might perceive grace and how it might influence them. I'm sorry, I forgot to get you caught up on some slides. So those are all just some points that were there, and I apologize that I got so wrapped up in this that I forgot about the slides. So let's go back to that incongruity notion for just a moment. So Mark McMahon, who I earlier quoted, has taken the lead in applying an understanding of grace in the context of Christian counseling. In his 2004 book, Why Sin Matters, written for a more general audience, and then in his 2008 book, that's where I drew the quotation earlier, Sin and Grace in Christian Counseling, which was written for a more professional audience, he tackles the unpopular topic of sin. His basic premise is that we will never grasp the magnificence of divine grace without taking seriously how far sin separates us from God. McMinn follows the lead of the noted psychiatrist Karl Menninger in his 1993 book, Whatever Became of Sin. It maintains that as many mental health professionals, both now Menninger and McMinn, maintain that as the mental health professions became the high priest of the new order of social morality, we lost the concept and language of sin. While both of Menninger and McMinn acknowledge the importance of the mental health professions, both bemoan the fact that sin somehow got lost in this post-Enlightenment transition. Without the language of sin, a true understanding of grace has been lost. In the words of Barclay's Perfection of Incongruity, we simply cannot grasp how amazing divine grace is because we have lost a true sense of how it saved a wretch like me. So let's look at grace as a promising area of research. To date, try to do this better here. To date, none of these areas have been subject to empirical research. So consider the extent to which perceptions of grace may have important implications for mental health functioning. For example, as already pointed out in Christian theology, the doctrine of grace is inextricably linked to the doctrine of sin, such that without a proper understanding of sin, the benefits of grace may not be fully realized. The person who believes that sin does not leave one in despair, but rather has been redemptively handled by a gracious God may be less inclined to suffer from a shame-based distress. So there is one study. I don't know the authors. I don't know who they are, Bronte and Wade, in 2012. And they found that the subjective experience of grace, and they were talking about divine grace here, was an essential element of personal growth in their sample of 25 adults. And this was published in a secular journal. Tomorrow we're going to be looking at the topic of humility, but I'm going to suggest that owning one's limitations and not succumbing to an improper pride are means by which humility may facilitate such a perceived experience of grace. We might recognize our need for grace more. So what I'd like to do is to consider some paradoxes in experiencing divine grace. There are many ironies related to grace. One such irony is that grace, once embodied, and this is the one I'm going to really dig into a little bit, is so compelling and transformative, yet people often find it so resistant, or they find themselves resistant to it. Nowhere is the transforming power of grace so well exemplified than in the Luke 19 biblical account of Zacchaeus. What is often overlooked in the story is the fact that Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector for Rome. Now, I think most of us who know the story know that he was a tax collector, okay? But I don't know if we've really grasped what it meant to be a tax collector at that time, especially for Rome. It meant that he was despised by his Jewish authorities as a traitor working for Rome. He was also extremely rich from ill-gotten taxes, including skimming money from the other tax collectors under his authority. He was, in the words of Tullian, and I can never pronounce his last name, Chavidian, something like that. So I'm just going to call him on a first-name basis, even though I've never met the guy and don't know him. Tullian, okay? He was, in the words of Tullian, the Bernie Madoff of his day. Okay, you know who I'm talking about, the man who bilked $65 billion from his clients. A movie was made about it. Robert De Niro, great movie, okay? And he is now serving 250, not De Niro, but Madoff is now serving 250 years in prison. Yet, Christ insisted on visiting Zacchaeus in his house. And Zacchaeus was incredibly transformed to the point that he said, "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone," and he knew he'd defrauded a lot of people, "of anything I restored fourfold." This was not a guy who was caught and made a plea bargain, nor was he hounded by a moral indignation by Christ, even though others muttered, "Christ has gone to be the guest of a sinner." Instead, Christ showed grace to the very one that others considered a scoundrel. However, as we pointed out in our 2017 paper, divine grace, and perhaps even human grace, is often difficult to accept. And it is often qualified by such terms as counterintuitive, radical, scandalous, suggesting that there must be some impediments here to fully apprehending grace. So like I have done throughout this talk, I will discuss obstacles to the full experience of divine grace in terms of two of the gift perfections noted by Barclay, the gift perfections of non-circularity and efficacy, because I think those are two that we live with and often serves as an impediment to being able to fully grasp and accept the notion of grace. So here they are. One is our inability to get beyond the need to structure our relationships in an equitable manner. Okay? Social psychologists, my field of training, talk a lot about this. In other words, there's some sort of circularity in our relationships, and we want it to be in an equitable manner. And the research, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this again tomorrow, but the research suggests that we really want equity in the relationships with a positive to negative ratio that's pretty good for both parties, you see. And if that imbalance seems to occur, then we feel very uncomfortable about that. And it's often the individual who actually has the higher, this is what a lot of research shows, positive to negative ratio. In other words, the relationship is benefiting me more than it is benefiting the other person relative to the cost of the relationship. And that is the person that's often most uncomfortable in the relationship and will try to do something. This is the circularity argument, to pay back any sense of indebtedness that they might have to that relationship. So with regards to circularity, as absurd as it might sound, it may very well be that some people may think that God somehow needs their contribution for the relationship to flourish, albeit through good works or simply through the perception of an indebtedness that somehow has to be repaid. Now, God may desire such results, but I think it is poor theology, and I say this as a non-theologian, to say that an infinitely resourced God needs such results as repayment. The other major perfecting notion is this one of efficacy that I think can actually serve again as an impediment. The sense that we are unable to live our lives in ways that measures up to a gift. The human sense of efficacy rather than a divine sense of efficacy. With regards to this notion, even though it may be that God desires for us to live lives full of grace and truth, the miscomprehension of what exactly this means may be impacted by our human standards of what it means to measure up. I know I have, from time to time, developed false standards of what holiness means that either runs contrary to this notion or is irrelevant to the notion of divine grace. But please keep in mind what I've mentioned earlier. This discussion today, especially in contrast to tomorrow's presentation, is largely speculative in nature. Very little research has been conducted on perceptions and apprehension of divine grace. And so there's questions like this with regards to the obstacles. Why is grace so difficult for people? Does the reception of grace somehow violate our sense of control over our own lives by placing ourselves at the perceived mercy of some other agent? Does it create an uncomfortable sense of obligation to the unobligated giver? If grace is directed towards someone else, are we likely to develop a sense of unfairness, as exemplified by the older brother in the parable of the prodigal son? To each of these questions, the trait of humility, again, what we'll be talking about tomorrow, I think could be an important contributing factor. Of course, the nature of that interaction may be different depending upon how we understand humility, and that's a very complex subject in itself. But these are just a few of the many questions that the empirical study of the perception of divine grace as religious inflections of the ordinary could explore. How people construe and apply divine grace is an extremely fertile ground for psychologists to till. And who better to till it than us integrationists? Before I conclude, I would like to take this presentation on a slightly different route for just a moment, but by providing some behind-the-scenes insights as how to a research initiative on grace has evolved. And we're calling this Project Amazing Grace. And I don't have any slides for this, so just please try to follow. I failed to mention actually, so I'll mention it now, that Robert Emmons, who was the first author of that paper, who's a renowned gratitude researcher at the University of California, Davis. I would say he's probably he'd be embarrassed for me to say, but might be the most renowned gratitude researcher throughout the entire world, I guess. First suggested the topic of grace to me in an informal conversation a number of years ago. Now, the two of us have collaborated on a number of projects, and we found that we really like working with each other. We work well together as a team. So he took the lead role in the early stages and discussed the idea of a large research initiative on grace with Nick Gibson, who is a program officer in the Human Science Department at the John Templeton Foundation. So the three of us, Bob, Nick, and myself, met on several occasions and eventually arrived at a consensus that we should focus the potential project that we were interested in developing on perceptions of divine grace, not human grace, since divine grace is the perfected prototype. We wanted to start with that. And after much discussion and a scouring of the literature, and some of that's what led to that paper that I've made reference to, on the role of divine grace in different religious traditions, we concluded that we should focus initially on divine grace within Christianity for a couple of reasons. One, we do think it's a more central feature in Christianity than in other religious traditions. We also felt that a more limited focus will allow us to better take an emic approach to the project. So we put a plan into place. First, we sought and were awarded funding from the John Templeton Foundation for an 18-month planning session. And sometimes this is how that particular foundation works. I'm going to call that phase one. And it consisted of 6 experts, psychologists, and theologians, in addition to Emmons and myself. And this team met on 2 occasions where we first developed a list of 12 possible research domains relevant to perceptions of divine grace. And then we eventually narrowed it down to the 4 that we thought were the most promising in terms of research fertility. One was on religious cognition and grace. We think that's very, very important. Another one is on the developmental origins to the receptivity of grace. What's going on in those important formative years that might make us more open or less open to grace, to divine grace? Then we also thought the obstacles to grace, and that's the one I've touched on a little bit in this talk. Why is it we often find it something that's supposed to be irresistible, but we resist it? And then finally, grace and well-being. It was from this project that 4 of the team members that I mentioned earlier published that paper in the APA journal, Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. The plan was, and still is, to make that publication a white paper for a larger funding initiative for other people to get funding on this particular topic. But things don't always go according to plans. We thought we would go from that phase 1 immediately to a second phase that I'm calling an RFP phase, request for proposals, where people would submit to us their proposals for research, and that paper would serve as a white paper. And of course, all of this is pending funding from the John Templeton Foundation. They've got to be behind this idea because I don't have it in my bank account, that's for sure. So we began, but then as we started working on this, we began to reconsider our plan. And though we set out that conceptualization of divine grace, largely based on Barclay's perfections that we've talked about here, we also recognize that this may not be exactly how people construe and experience divine grace. So we've decided to put that project, that RFP project, on hold and to replace it with a different phase 2 project. And again, with funding from the Templeton Foundation, we've commissioned 8 dissertation projects by graduate students at various institutions, some Christian and some secular, to conduct grounded theory, qualitative interviews with a standard protocol to see how Christians representing different groups actually think about and apply divine grace to their ordinary lives. Hence, this has influenced a lot of my thinking for what I'm talking with you about in these 3 days. So what are some of those different groups? We have an evangelical group that's been identified. We have a mainline Protestant group. We have a Catholic group. We have a Quaker group. We have an LDS group. We have an Orthodox group, and we have access to a LGBTQ affirming group as well. And to see how we think. So this is going to be our phase 2. We did get funding for it, and we just started this two-year project in January. So we hope to use what we learned from phase 2 to conduct what we will call that phase 3 RFP project, again, pending funding from the John Templeton Foundation. We hope to award somewhere between 8 and 10 projects at about $200,000 each for empirical research on divine grace in accord with those 4 domains that I mentioned earlier. So that phase, if it should come to pass, would begin either in 2021 or 2022, just as some of you who are graduate students are entering the real world, hopefully some of you into the real world of research. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you very much.